December 17, 1944. Somewhere near the Ardennes forest, Belgium. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, blanketing the world in white, and hiding the chaos beneath it. The German counteroffensive, what Berlin called Wacht am Rhein, had begun just days earlier. The men of Oberleutnant Karl Weber's supply detachment were exhausted, their fuel trucks running on fumes, their rations almost gone. They'd been told the attack would punch through the Allied lines, split the American armies, and force a surrender before Christmas. But standing in that frozen clearing, Weber wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about hunger. His men hadn't eaten properly in days. Then, through the drifting snow, came a sound, the faint rumble of engines. Weber raised his binoculars. Out of the forest emerged a column of olive-green trucks, American, unguarded, their white stars barely visible under mud and frost. A supply convoy, lost or abandoned in the confusion. Rouse! Move! Weber barked. His men, gaunt and shivering, sprinted forward with rifles raised. Within minutes, they surrounded the trucks. No shots fired. The American drivers had already fled. When they pried open the first crate, the men froze. Inside were tins and packages they'd never seen before, real coffee, chocolate bars, cans of meat marked Spam, and something called Rations. Weber reached for one, tore it open, and stared at its contents, a packet of biscuits, a tin of ham and eggs, powdered lemonade, even chewing gum and cigarettes. The men laughed, not out of joy, but disbelief. Even their soldiers eat like officers, one muttered. Weber said nothing. He just looked at the neat, efficient packaging, the tiny printed instructions, the American logos. It felt less like military issue and more like a product from another world. He ordered the men to load everything they could onto their trucks. But even as they worked, something uneasy settled in his chest. This wasn't just food. This was proof. Proof that the enemy they were fighting wasn't starving, wasn't desperate. The Americans were well-fed, well-supplied, and seemingly endless. As night fell, Weber sat by the fire, turning an empty ration tin in his hands. The embossed letters read, "Packed by Kellogg's Company, Battle Creek, Michigan." He whispered the words to himself, as though reading them might make them real. Battle Creek, Michigan. A single town, producing enough food to feed thousands of men halfway across the world. And in that moment, the fire crackling, the snow whispering around him, Oberleutnant Karl Weber began to suspect something terrifying, that Germany might already have lost, and none of them knew it yet. He didn't know it yet, but this discovery would spread through the camp like wildfire, and ignite a realization that would shatter morale across the front lines. Morning broke cold and silent. Smoke from burned-out trucks drifted over the frozen field like fog. Weber's men were awake early, huddled around their newfound treasure, steaming tins of American rations heated over small fires. For the first time in weeks, they were eating warm food. The rich smell of meat and coffee cut through the winter air. Better than the stuff from Berlin, one soldier joked, chewing on a biscuit. Another laughed, if this is what the Americans give to privates, what do their generals eat? The laughter didn't last long. Weber sat apart from them, flipping through a soggy supply manifest taken from one of the trucks. It was neatly typed, stamped, and organized. Hundreds of tons of supplies, all bound for just one division. Ammunition, blankets, chocolate, cigarettes. Each crate had its destination printed clearly, like clockwork. He frowned. The efficiency was staggering. Germany's supply system had become chaos, handwritten orders, missing fuel, factories bombed to rubble. He'd seen entire battalions halted for lack of a few spare parts. And yet here were the Americans, moving mountains of material across an ocean as if it were nothing. A sergeant approached, holding up a can of peaches. "Herr Oberleutnant, do we keep these or send them back to HQ?" Weber took the can, stared at the bright yellow label. "Keep them," he said quietly. "HQ won't need them where they're going." The men didn't understand, but they obeyed. Later that day, Weber climbed a small ridge overlooking the valley. From there, he could see the broken road winding west, the path the Americans had used before the German advance. Scattered along it were more wrecks, more supplies, more signs of a war machine that seemed endless. He crouched, running his gloved hand through the snow until his fingers brushed metal. Another discarded tin marked U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Beneath it, stamped in tiny letters, Made in Chicago. Chicago. Detroit. Cleveland. Cities he'd only read about, names that now echoed in his mind like thunder. Factories that never slept. Ships that crossed the Atlantic faster than U-boats could sink them. Planes that filled the sky. Food enough to feed an army and then some. He thought of the German people back home, the ration cards, the thin soup, the quiet hunger in the eyes of mothers and children. And then he looked again at the mountain of captured food his men were devouring. For the first time, the illusion cracked. They'd been told this was Germany's moment, the last great counterattack, a strike that would turn the tide. But as Weber watched his men eating enemy food, wrapped in stolen American blankets, he saw the truth with painful clarity. The Reich wasn't winning. It was feeding on the leftovers of a nation that could replace everything it lost by the next sunrise. He lowered his head, whispering a thought he dared not say aloud. If this is what their soldiers carry, what hope do we have? That night, as distant artillery rumbled in the dark, Weber recorded his thoughts in a small, leather-bound journal. He wrote about the rations, about the abundance, the precision, the sheer scale of American industry. His handwriting trembled with cold, and with fear. He ended the entry with just 5 words. We cannot match this power. The next morning, orders came down from command: push west, seize more American supplies, use whatever could be found. The order was meant to sound victorious, but to Weber, it felt like a confession. Germany was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to survive on whatever the enemy left behind. But the greatest shock was still to come, when Weber learned just how little those American rations represented of the empire behind them. By December 22, the snow had deepened to knee-height. Weber's trucks crawled along the frozen road, their engines sputtering on captured American fuel. The radio crackled with fragments of bad news: Allied counterattacks, bridges destroyed, units cut off. The great Ardennes offensive was already unraveling. Weber's men were silent. Even the youngest among them, who had cheered when the offensive began, now looked hollow-eyed. Their rifles were slung loosely, their thoughts elsewhere, mostly on the next meal. They had more American food than ammunition. When night came, they camped inside an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of a burned-out village. Weber set a lantern on a table covered with ration boxes. He picked one up, breakfast unit, K-ration, and smiled grimly. Bacon, biscuits, powdered coffee. It wasn't just food anymore. It was a symbol. He gathered his men. Eat, he told them. You'll need your strength. They did, greedily at first, then quietly. The only sounds were spoons scraping tins and the faint crackle of the fire. One of the younger soldiers, Muller, looked up. Herr Oberleutnant, do you think Berlin knows how much the Americans have? Weber stared into the fire. Berlin knows, he said softly. They just don't tell us. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph, his wife and little boy, taken in Dresden before the bombings began. He turned it over and looked at the back. Written there, in her careful handwriting, was a line from a letter she'd sent months earlier: the shops are empty again. But we are proud of you. He folded it once, then slipped it away. Outside, the distant thunder of artillery rolled closer, not German guns this time, but American ones. Weber knew the sound. The front was collapsing. Soon they'd be cut off. He took one last tin from the pile, opened it, and stared at its neat, perfect label. Packed by General Foods Corporation, New York. Thousands of kilometers away, entire factories were running just to feed the men now marching toward him. Trains, trucks, ships, a machine so vast he couldn't even imagine its scale. For the first time in the war, he didn't feel anger. Or pride. Only awe. The fire dimmed. Snowflakes drifted through the broken windows. Weber spoke quietly, as though to himself. They will win. Not because they are braver, but because they can feed their courage. His men said nothing. They didn't need to. The next morning, the first American tanks appeared on the horizon. Weber ordered his men to fall back through the forest. They abandoned most of the supplies, crates of untouched food left stacked in the snow. Hours later, U.S. soldiers from the 2nd Armored Division found the farmhouse. They entered cautiously, rifles raised. Inside, they discovered the tins, still warm from the fire, and a single German field journal left open on the table. The last line, written in a steady hand, read: "The war is already lost. We have seen America, and it cannot be defeated." The young American sergeant who found it closed the book, tucked it into his pack, and looked around the empty room. He saw the remains of his army's rations, half-eaten by the men they were fighting. He shook his head slowly. "Guess they finally figured it out," he said. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, endless, indifferent. The war would rage on for months, but for Oberleutnant Karl Weber, the realization had already come. The moment he opened that first American ration, he'd tasted the truth. Germany wasn't starving because of fate. It was starving because it had chosen a war it could never sustain. And across the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a single German officer carried that truth with him, not as defeat, but as understanding. The kind of understanding that comes too late to change anything, but just in time to see the world as it really is.